What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Ask Paul, the podcast where we answer those questions that are submitted online at paulabernathy.com. If you've got an electrical code related question, doesn't matter whether it's 2017 edition, 2020 edition, it doesn't matter. Submit it to paulabernathy.com and we're more than happy to try to answer your question and give you some direction on where you need to go to better understand the National Electrical Code. Of course, all electrically related topics are welcome. So on today's episode, answer a question for a gentleman that sent in a question, and they want to know a little bit more about making connections with PV on the supply side. Now, granted, the 2020 code gives us a little more clearance. I shouldn't say clearance. Gives us more clarity, I guess I should say clearance. I don't know where that came from. More clarity on the application of supply side connections and what we need to do. So there's a certain number of things that we need to do. Now, this question generally is asking for my opinion, but I'll probably dig a little deeper so that they're fully aware of things that you have to be aware of when it comes to making supply side connections and what the National Electrical Code says about that. All right, so I'm going to read the question, but not until I run a word from our sponsor. Again, we have to pay the bills. And again, if you are looking for some nifty swag to show off your pride being an electrician, then do me a favor, just jump on over to electricianpride.com. So I'm going to run that commercial, and then we're going to get into today's episode. Today's show is sponsored by electricianpride.com, your one-stop shop for electrician-specific t-shirts, hoodies, phone cases, mugs, die-cut stickers, leggings, and so much more. Featuring unique designs for electricians, journeymen, and master electricians, as well as electrical engineers and electrical inspectors. For more information on all the products that are available, visit us at www.electricianpride.com today. All right, so again, if you want to get some nice nifty swag, then check out Electrician Pride. That's electrician, Pride.com. We appreciate all your purchases there. These are all one-off items, so these aren't mass-produced items. So again, make sure you're aware of that when you go there. We're making them just for you. And there's a lot of different designs to choose from. Okay, there's even our newest design. It's over there dealing with the Zeus, god of lightning, and all that kind of stuff. So check that out. Again, a lot of good master electrician and journeyman electrician swag. Okay. Now, let's get into today's question. So the question says, hey, Paul, what are your thoughts about doing a supply-side connection for a PV system on a service that has no main overcurrent protected device and is fed directly from the utility meter to a main lug only, or for an older style split bus with a main lug only up top and a breaker feeding a lower portion of the load center or panel board? I try to avoid line side taps when the bus does not have main overcurrent protection. Am I being overly cautious? Well, I guess the first thing I should say is you're not being overly cautious. You're doing your due diligence and trying to make a decision that's best for you, obviously, in order to be able to do this. And if you've come to the conclusion that you don't want to make that connection, or you don't feel comfortable making a connection on the supply side, then that's totally up to you. That is totally up to you. So again, let nobody get in your grill about it, because again, that's a choice that you have to make on how comfortable you feel making those types of connections. Okay. All right. So getting kind of beyond that aspect of it and kind of digging into the code. So first things first, we're talking about making a connection on the supply side. Okay. Now he talks about it being, where there's no main. So this is obviously where it was previously. You would have been allowed the 6 disconnect rule in a single enclosure. I'm going to use that for example. Not allowed in the 2020 code, but was very much allowed in the 2017 code. That's where you come in, you hit the main lug only, and then you have up to 6 circuit breakers grouped in the same location. And that was perfectly acceptable to be able to do in the National Electrical Code. Now, you could still do that feeders downstream because you have a device upstream, so that's not, we're just talking services here. So that's not permitted. Now, nothing is wrong with the 6 disconnect rule. You could have 6 separate disconnects, you could have vertical switch gear with separate sections, and you could have meter centers with separate sections with the meter and has its separate breaker in it. I mean, you still have those allowances in the code. That didn't go away in 230.70. That's not gone, okay? And so I don't want to give the impression that, 230.71, where is the maximum number of disconnects. That's not gone. That's still there. You just cannot do this in a single enclosure. And if you go look at 230.71, it's now an A and a B, A being your general, and B being the 2 to 6 service disconnecting means, and that gives you your rules there. Okay, but that's not necessarily what this person's talking about right up front. They're talking about they're concerned about making a connection on the supply side, right? So first things first, where in the code gives us permission to do this? I guess that's the first thing we should always kind of think about. Where's the code telling me that I can do this? Well, in 230.82, it's giving me the permission, and this is for equipment connected on the supply side of a service disconnecting me. Now remember, even in their example with the main lug only, there's still going to be probably 6 disconnect rule going on. So that's qualifying under the rules. So those are your main service disconnects. Okay, so this is a connection that's being made on the supply side. You get that permission to do so in 230.82, and specifically for PV is what he's asking. That would be item 6, and it says photovoltaic systems, fuel cell systems, wind electric systems, energy storage systems, or interconnected electric power production sources, if provided with a disconnecting means listed as suitable for use as service equipment and overcurrent protection as specified in Part 7 of Article 230. And of course, if you look at Part 7 of 230, that's the when you're looking at service equipment and the overcurrent protection and all those rules that are associated. That starts at 230.90 and that runs all the way to 230.95. All right. So supposedly you meet all those rules and everything's good to go. You're going to make a connection on the supply side. Now, that's the rules that tell us that we can do that. Okay, that's the first part. The next part, it says, okay, provided this rule already tells me that I can make that connection. So first part of your question is that yes, it might be a main lug only. Okay, but it's probably main lug and it's probably meeting the 6 disconnect rules. So there's 6 breakers in there. Or it's meeting the old split bus type where it's hitting the top. You still have the 6 disconnects, but one of them is feeding a lower bus. It still falls under the 6 disconnect rule. Okay? It's been around a long time. So that's probably what you're dealing with. So your connection on the supply side, I usually tell people in this question, it is irrelevant the type of equipment we're talking about. It would be no different if you were making a connection on the supply side and it had a main disconnecting means in the service equipment. It's irrelevant. You're still making that connection on the supply side. All right, so we have that allowance in 230.82, and item 6 is letting us have that equipment on the supply side of a service disconnect. And again, taking into account that what he's probably talking about is main lug only with no main, but there's probably 6 disconnects in there. Okay, all right, so that's that part. So I don't have a problem with that. So the next question, people say, well, okay, for years, I didn't know, how do I bond it? How do I do the different things that I need to do with all the metal parts and everything that is on the supply side? Because I'm making connection, and for all intents and purposes, those are still service conductors, even though they're extending to something like PV or whatever. Since they're supplied on the, they're fed from the supply side of a service disconnect, then there's no way to kill it, right? You got the meter, and that's it. So, what gives me these rules? Well, for us, luckily, and he didn't give it really a code reference or the cycle that he's under, but we do get some direction in the 2020 edition under 250.25. Now, we're going to assume, because of how he says this, that we're dealing with a grounded system. So what it says is 250.25 says, grounded systems permitted to be connected on the supply side of the service disconnect. So this goes hand in hand with 230.82, and you'll see that it actually says that in the actual body of the code. It says, and I'm at 250.25 right now, the charging statement, the very beginning, it says the grounding of systems connected on the supply side of a service disconnect, or in your case, a panel that has either the 6 disconnect rule going on, which was legal all the way up to the 2020 edition, or a split bus where you have 6 disconnects, one's feeding a lower portion, but you still have the 6 disconnect rule at the top. That's, feeding things like water heaters and other type of loads, okay? So it says The grounding of systems connected on the supply side of a service disconnect as permitted in 230.85, so there's your permission, that are in enclosures separate from the service equipment enclosure. Okay, again, they're on the supply side. They're not in the service equipment. They're on the supply side. Shall comply with 250.25A or B. A being the grounded system, which is probably what you're dealing with. B being an ungrounded systems and not what we're going to discuss here, because it really wasn't germane to the question anyway. And I think we probably answered the question, but we're just going to dig a little deeper. So what does A say? And also I should tell you, you notice the ends in the margin. That means this is new. Now, prior to this, we didn't have any express language that said how we treat it, although we knew that it was on the supply side, so we treat it like service. We do it, we bond all metal parts together. We treat it like a service, even though it's not the service, but that's what we have to do because it's on the supply side and we need to bond all those metal parts together so everything's at the same potential, okay? So this just added clarity in the 2020 edition to what we need to do. So it says, A, which is dealing with grounded systems. It says, if the utility supply system is grounded, and again, if it's bringing a grounded conductor, then it is grounded. It says the grounding of systems permitted to be connected on the supply side of the service disconnect are installed in one or more separate enclosures from the service equipment enclosures shall comply with the requirements of 250.24A through D. Now that's important because 250.24A through D tells us how to make those applications. A, talking in general about system grounding connections. Then you've got B, which is talking about main bonding jumper requirements. Okay. C and D. So you've got all of your requirements here. And of course, D is talking about grounding electroconductors. And of course, those systems, if it's PV systems, going to have its own rules that you'd have to follow. So as long as you can follow the rules in 250.24A through D, and as long as it's on the supply side and it's an application that is permitted in 230.82, which sounds like yours is, then you're perfectly fine. Now, you're overly cautious about it. It's okay. But remember, you're making that connection on the supply side. If it had a main breaker, it really wouldn't matter. Because what you're going to need to do is once you make that connection, you're going to terminate into an overcurrent protected device anyway. And it's got to be SUSE rated, and could be the PV disconnect for the AC side. Okay, but you're going to have to do all that. So nothing changes that. So whether or not you have a main breaker or not, and of course we won't get into the PV aspects of the bus and the ratings and all that kind of stuff. That's for a different topic, and that's not what was asked here in this episode. But that's kind of gives you some insight. So my question is, are you being overly cautious? Maybe, but that's a choice you have to make. But just remember, when you do make those connections, again, on the supply side, you're doing it the same way, whether or not there was a main disconnect inside of the service equipment or not. You're still going to be making that connection on the supply side. And so you have to follow all those rules accordingly. And of course, hopefully you're very much familiar with all of the PV rules that you have to be familiar with in 690. And you're following all those rules, the interconnecting in 705. And you're comfortable with all that. And then, of course, you've got your grounding and bonding rules that are 250.25. And then ultimately it's saying you treat it like you would a service in 250.24A through D. And if you meet all those rules, you're good to go. Okay. So hopefully that answers your question on this episode about it. So again, I have no problem with the connection on the supply side. Whether or not you had a main breaker or not, it's irrelevant to me. As long as you continue to follow the rules and assume that you do understand all the rules associated with PVs and everything moving forward, then you'd be good to go and there wouldn't be a problem. Okay. So hopefully you got something out of that and maybe learned a little bit about, what you can and what you can't do. So till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.